The wheelchair lay overturned in the gutter like a broken promise. Rain hammered the asphalt in sheets so thick the streetlights bled into orange smears, and Sarah Edward, the Sarah Edward, whose name had once graced the cover of Forbes 3 years running, lay on the wet pavement in a soaked white robe, her palms shredded against the road, her legs refusing every command. She screamed at them in silence. She had crawled 17 feet from the curb before her arms gave out. 17 feet. That was what was left of a woman who had once commanded boardrooms of 200. 17 feet of rain-slicked concrete, and the particular kind of shame that doesn't make a sound. She didn't cry. She'd learned in the last 8 weeks that tears were a currency she could no longer afford. The black motorcade materialized from the rain the way danger always does, without warning, without apology. 3 vehicles. Blacked out windows. Absolute silence beneath the downpour. The center door opened, and a man stepped out wearing a suit the color of a starless sky, moving with the kind of controlled, predatory grace that told you immediately, this man has never been afraid of anything that walked the earth. He stopped 3 feet from her. She tilted her face up, rain running into her eyes, and looked at him the way a person looks when they have absolutely nothing left to lose. He looked back at her the way a person looks when they recognize something priceless lying in the mud. Sarah Edward, Jae-Hyun said. His voice was low, unhurried, a man accustomed to rooms going quiet when he spoke. Your father saved my life 10 years ago. I told him I would repay that debt to whoever carried his name. He crouched down, suit jacket absorbing the shadows, and extended his hand. It appears, he said quietly, that the time has come. 41 days earlier, Sarah Edward had been untouchable. Or so she believed. She had built Edward Global from the smoking ruins of grief. Her parents' private plane had gone down over the Atlantic when Sarah was just 19, leaving behind 2 things, a mountain of debt the lawyers said was unsurvivable, and a single handwritten note from her father tucked inside the company's founding charter. A diamond doesn't ask the earth's permission to be valuable, Sarah. It simply endures. She had taped that note to her bathroom mirror and worked 16-hour days for 11 years until the debt was ash and the company was a titan. But towers built by lonely hands develop a particular kind of crack, invisible from the outside, catastrophic under the right pressure. And Sarah Edward, for all her brilliance, had never learned how to distinguish between a man who admired her power and a man who wanted to consume it. Malcolm had walked into her life wearing the disguise of the former. He spoke to her like she was the most extraordinary thing he had ever encountered. He listened, really listened, in a way no one ever had. He made her laugh at charity galas and brought her coffee exactly the way she took it without being asked. For a woman who had spent 2 decades being respected by everyone and known by no one, Malcolm's focused intensity felt like finally being seen. She married him on a Saturday in March. She signed over joint power of attorney on a Sunday in June, because he had asked with such quiet reasonableness, and because love, she had decided, required a certain amount of trust made visible. By the following February, Malcolm had constructed a paper empire inside her paper empire, shell companies, forged signatures, redirected accounts. A masterpiece of legal predation so elegant that by the time Sarah's SUV was forced off the highway on a Tuesday night in a rainstorm that the police report would call an accident, every financial exit had already been sealed. She spent 2 months in a coma. Malcolm spent those 2 months at her bedside, in the photographs, anyway. In the accounting records, he spent them emptying everything she had ever built. She woke up paralyzed from the waist down. The doctors said it might be temporary. Malcolm served her divorce papers the same afternoon, slid across her hospital tray by a lawyer she had never met, citing irreconcilable differences in a marriage that was 8 months old. He had drained her accounts, dissolved her board majority, and placed Edward Global into receivership under a holding company that traced, through 6 layers of paperwork, back to himself. When the facility's insurance coverage ran out, they moved her to a government-subsidized care home where the hallway smelled of antiseptic and abandonment. That was where the orderly had left her chair too close to the ramp's edge. That was how Sarah Edward, Forbes cover, industry titan, her father's diamond, had ended up on 17 feet of rain-soaked pavement, staring up at a man in a black suit who spoke as though the storm hadn't noticed him. She looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment. She thought about her father's note. It simply endures. She took his hand. The glass fortress. Sarah Edward did not inherit her empire. She excavated it, from grief, from silence, from the particular kind of fury that only orphans know. She had been 19 years old when the call came. Her parents' Cessna had gone down over the Atlantic on a clear Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that had no business hosting tragedy. By the time she drove herself to the airport, because there was no one left to drive her, she had already made the decision that would define the next 2 decades of her life. She would not fall apart. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Edward Global, at the time of her parents' deaths, was a mid-sized real estate and development firm with a respectable portfolio and a mountain of debt that the lawyers said, gently but firmly, could not be survived. Sarah sat in a conference room full of men twice her age, listened to every word they said, and then told them she would need 60 days to review the financials herself. She had turned the company profitable in 14 months. By 32, Edward Global was a billion-dollar enterprise spanning commercial development, sustainable infrastructure, and urban renewal projects in 7 American cities. By 34, she had her face on magazine covers she never asked for and a corner office in a Chicago skyscraper with floor-to-ceiling windows that made the city feel like something she owned. What those magazines never mentioned, what she never mentioned, was the silence that waited for her every evening when the office cleared out. The way she sometimes stood at those enormous windows after everyone had gone home, watching the city pulse with life beneath her, feeling like a woman pressed against the outside of a warm room, looking in. She was successful. She was respected. She was alone in ways that success could not touch. Sarah Edward, CEO of Edward Global, titan of industry, daughter of tragedy, had never once in her adult life felt fully known by another human being. And that particular hunger, quiet and patient as it was, would cost her everything. The velvet baritone. Malcolm arrived at her life the way a perfect storm arrives, gradually, and then all at once. He was introduced to her at a charity gala by a board member she trusted, presented as a private equity consultant with an impressive roster of clients and a track record that checked out across 3 independent searches. He was handsome in a composed, almost architectural way, the kind of man who made a room feel more deliberate simply by occupying it. But it wasn't his looks that disarmed her. It was the way he listened. At that first dinner, he asked her about her parents, not the company they'd left behind, not the deals she'd made, but them. What had her mother laughed like? What had her father's hands felt like when he held hers at age 7? Sarah had answered before she even realized she was answering, and sat back afterward with the strange, unmoored feeling of having said something true in public for the first time in years. Malcolm was deliberate in all the ways that loneliness mistakes for devotion. He brought her coffee exactly as she took it without being reminded. He showed up to events she didn't expect him to attend, not intrusively but simply, there, steady, present. He asked permission before he reached for her hand the first time, and she had felt something crack open behind her sternum at the gesture. What she did not see, what she was not built to see yet, was the calculation running beneath every choice he made. The months of research. The quiet conversations with former Edward Global partners who had grievances. The paperwork already being drafted in an office she would never visit, by lawyers she would never meet. She saw a man who finally saw her. She was wrong. She was looking at a mirror he had built specifically to reflect her deepest wants back at her. They married the following March at a small ceremony in the mountains, just 40 guests, because Sarah had never liked spectacle. She wore ivory silk and her mother's pearl earrings. She cried only once, and briefly, because she thought it was happiness. She signed the joint power of attorney 3 months later. Malcolm had asked with such quiet reasonableness, if something happens to either of us, we should be able to act on each other's behalf, and she had agreed, because that was what trust looked like made visible. That was what love looked like when it was serious. She had never been more wrong about anything in her life. Shattered mirror. The accident happened on a Tuesday night in February, on the kind of highway that feels safe until it doesn't. Sarah had left a board meeting late, declined her driver's offer to stay, it was only 40 minutes, and she needed the quiet, and merged onto Interstate 90 heading west toward home. The rain had started an hour earlier and was getting heavier by the minute. She never saw the second vehicle until its headlights filled her rearview mirror, close and fast and wrong. The impact came from the left rear quarter, a precise hit that sent her SUV spinning across 2 lanes before she lost control of it entirely. The guardrail stopped the car. The drop on the other side of it did not bear thinking about. Witnesses would later describe a black vehicle that had not stopped. The police report called it a hit and run. The word accident appeared 11 times in the official documentation. Sarah Edward arrived at Northwestern Memorial Hospital with a fractured spine, a severe traumatic brain injury, and internal bleeding that required 4 hours of emergency surgery to address. She was placed in an induced coma that night. She would not wake up for 61 days. The vulture at the bedside. Malcolm was photographed at her bedside on day 1. The image ran in 2 business publications, Grieving Husband, Vigil, Devotion. He wore the expression of a man gutted by worry, and he wore it perfectly. What the photographs did not capture happened in the hours between visits. The calls to her CFO that began in week 2, warmly professional, citing emergency continuity protocols. The board meetings he attended as her proxy, citing the power of attorney she had signed with such open-hearted trust. The gradual, elegant restructuring of Edward Global's accounts, funds redirected to holding companies with names like Meridian Consolidated and Lakeview Asset Partners, both of which traced, through 6 careful layers of shell incorporation, back to Malcolm. By week 6, $43 million had been moved. By week 8, her majority board position had been quietly dissolved through a series of share transfers her signatures, expertly forged, had authorized. On day 60, a lawyer Sarah had never met arrived at her hospital room with a briefcase and a document wallet. He set the divorce papers on her bedside table with the practiced neutrality of a man who had learned not to feel things at work. The papers cited irreconcilable differences. The proposed settlement offered Sarah a cash sum of $240,000 in exchange for all claims against Edward Global's assets. $240,000. For an empire worth north of $1 billion. The lawyer left the papers beside her unconscious hand and departed without a word to the nursing staff. In the hallway, Malcolm's attorney made a call. "It's done," he said. 2 floors below, in the hospital lobby, Malcolm finished his coffee, straightened his jacket, and walked out into the Chicago afternoon like a man who had simply concluded some routine business. The fall. She woke up on a Wednesday morning to the sound of a monitor beeping and the specific quality of light that means institution. For a long moment she simply existed, breathing, blinking, feeling the weight of consciousness return piece by piece. The paralysis announced itself when she tried to sit up. Her legs did not respond. She stared at them for what felt like a very long time. The neurologist explained it carefully: spinal cord contusion, incomplete injury, possibility of partial recovery with aggressive rehabilitation. Possibly. With time. With the right care. She asked for her phone. It was gone. She asked for Malcolm. A nurse told her, gently, that her husband had not been in since week 7. The divorce papers were produced by a hospital administrator who seemed pained by the duty. Sarah read every word. Her hands were steady. Something behind her eyes went very quiet and very cold. She signed nothing. It didn't matter. The restructuring Malcolm had engineered required no further signatures from her. The insurance coverage on her hospital room, which had been tied to Edward Global's executive policy, lapsed the following Friday. The hospital's financial counselor arrived on Monday with pamphlets about government-subsidized care facilities. The Linden Park Care Center was 40 minutes from downtown Chicago, in a neighborhood that had been declining for 2 decades. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and something older and sadder beneath it. Sarah's room had one window that faced a brick wall. She had gone from a penthouse to this in the time it takes a man to execute a plan he had been building for years. She did not cry. She stared at the brick wall outside her window and thought about her father's note. A diamond doesn't ask the earth's permission to be valuable. It simply endures, *. She was still enduring. But endurance, she was beginning to understand, was not the same as living. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe to our channel now and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Blood and rain. It was the orderly's carelessness that sent her over the ramp's edge. He had parked her chair too close to the slope, turned away to answer his phone, and by the time he turned back, the chair had tipped sideways on the uneven pavement and Sarah was on the ground. It was raining. It had been raining all day with the particular relentlessness of a Chicago spring storm that had decided to take its time. The orderly panicked and retreated inside to find help, which left Sarah alone on the wet pavement of the facility's side exit ramp for 4 minutes and 37 seconds. She knew the time precisely because she counted it. She tried to push herself upright. She managed to drag herself 17 feet on her hands before her arms gave out completely. The white robe they'd dressed her in that morning was soaked through and filthy, clinging to her like something defeated. Her palms were shredded against the asphalt. She stopped moving and lay still, rain hammering the pavement around her, and stared up at the orange-smeared sky. She thought, *, this is what he reduced me to. This is the end of the story Malcolm wrote, *. And then the black motorcade materialized from the rain. 3 vehicles, blacked-out windows, moving in absolute formation. The center door opened before the car had fully stopped, and a man stepped out wearing a suit the color of a starless sky. He moved across the wet ground with the controlled, predatory grace of someone who had never once in his life needed to hurry because the world had learned to wait for him. He stopped 3 feet from her and looked down. Sarah looked up. She had nothing left to perform. No composure to arrange. She just looked at him, rain in her eyes, hands bleeding, dignity in ruins, and held his gaze. He crouched down to her level. Up close, his face was chiseled and unreadable, the expression of a man who processed the world through calculation rather than feeling, except for his eyes, which were doing something complicated. "Sarah Edward," Jae-Hyun Park said. His voice was low and unhurried, a man accustomed to rooms going silent when he spoke. "Your father pulled me out of a federal holding cell in Seoul 10 years ago. Used every connection he had. Told the men I worked for to back down. They backed down, because James Edward had a reputation that crossed oceans." He paused. "He asked nothing in return except that I repay the debt to whoever carried his name." He extended his hand. It was steady. Unloved. Offered without theater. "It appears," he said quietly, "that the time has come." Sarah looked at his hand for 3 full seconds. Then she thought of her father. Then she took it. The Obsidian Estate. The Park Estate sat 20 miles outside Chicago on 40 acres of land that had been carefully designed to look like it had never been designed at all. Rolling grounds, dense tree lines, a main house built from black granite and glass that absorbed the sky rather than reflecting it. It was a fortress dressed as a retreat, and Sarah, as Jae-Hyun's motorcade swept through its gates, understood immediately that this was a home built by a man who understood that real safety was invisible. He gave her the East Wing. A rehabilitation specialist arrived the following morning. A physician came twice daily for the first 2 weeks. No one asked her questions she hadn't invited. No one offered pity, which was the greatest mercy they could have shown her. Jae-Hyun himself was a presence she absorbed gradually, the way you absorb weather, not in a single moment but across many. He appeared at her doorway sometimes in the evenings with tea she hadn't asked for. He ate dinner with her 3 times a week, and talked about things that had nothing to do with her situation, the architecture of Seoul, the first time he'd seen the Pacific, a novel his mother had loved that he'd read 5 times. He never asked about Malcolm. He never offered reassurances he couldn't guarantee. It was during the 3rd week that his lawyer, a precise woman named Hannah Woo, arrived with a document that changed everything. "The lineage clause," Hannah said, laying it on the table before Sarah. "Your parents' original partnership agreement with the firm that seeded Edward Global's first capital injection, a firm that Jae-Hyun's family has controlled for 20 years. The clause states that in any event of hostile takeover, fraud, or forced dispossession of a direct Edward heir, the seed capital reverts to active status. Meaning it never fully converted to equity. Meaning it was never Malcolm's to restructure." Sarah read the document twice. Then she looked up at Jae-Hyun, who was standing by the window with his hands in his pockets, watching the grounds. "You knew about this before you came for me," she said. "I knew your father put it there," he said. "He told me once that he built every fortress with a hidden door. He just never told me which door, or when it would matter." He turned to look at her. "I think he knew, somehow, that it would matter for you." Sarah sat with that for a long time. Then she said, "How much of the company can we recover?" Hannah smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. "All of it. If we move in the next 45 days. Risking the empire." What Jae-Hyun did next was not legal. He knew that going in. Malcolm had sold Edward Global's primary debt instruments, the notes that backed the company's real estate portfolio, to a financial entity called Hargrove Capital, which was, in fact, a front for his own long-term asset extraction. The plan had been elegant: let the debt instruments mature, force the company into technical default, then acquire the underlying assets at distressed prices through Hargrove. Clean. Legal. Invisible. Jae-Hyun bought the debt instruments back. He did it through a network of holding entities that operated in the gray architecture of international finance, the kind of structures that federal investigators spent years trying to understand and never quite did. He spent $230 million in 11 days, moving capital through 7 jurisdictions, and he did it in a way that left no clear line back to himself but a very clear line forward to Sarah. His attorney advised against it 3 times. Jae-Hyun listened to all 3 advisories and proceeded. "You're putting yourself in federal crosshairs," his second-in-command, a hard-eyed man named Soo-jin, told him the morning after the final transfer. "I'm aware," Jae-Hyun said. "This is not how we operate. We don't take on legal exposure for Soo-jin." His voice was quiet. Final. Her father stood in a room full of people who wanted him to look the other way, and he didn't. He took the exposure. He paid the cost. A beat. "I know what a debt is." Soo-jin said nothing more. On the same day the final transfer cleared, Sarah stood up from her wheelchair for the first time in 60 days, unsteady, gripping the parallel bars with white knuckles, legs shaking like a building learning to trust its own foundation, and took 3 steps. 3 steps. She cried then, for the first time since the night she'd woken up in the hospital. Not from pain. From something that felt, cautiously and tentatively, like the beginning of becoming herself again. Jae-Hyun, standing in the doorway of the rehabilitation room, said nothing. But she caught his expression before he could arrange it back into neutrality, and what she saw there was not the calculated interest of a man repaying a debt. It was something older and less negotiable than that. The boardroom coup. The emergency sale of Edward Global's remaining assets was scheduled for a Thursday at 2 p.m., in the 42nd floor conference room of a downtown Chicago tower that Sarah had visited 100 times. Malcolm arrived at 1:45, unhurried, wearing his best suit, carrying the particular confidence of a man who believes the last door has been locked from the inside. He was halfway through his opening remarks to the assembled board when the conference room doors opened. Sarah Edward walked in. She was not in a wheelchair. She moved with a cane, carefully, with the deliberate precision of someone who had earned every step in the past 3 weeks, but she walked in a charcoal power suit that fit her like armor. Hair pulled back. Expression so composed it was almost frightening. Behind her came Hannah Woo, carrying a document case. Behind Hannah came 2 federal investigators from the SEC's Chicago field office, who had been briefed the previous evening on what they were about to hear. Malcolm's face went through several things in rapid succession. His attorney reached for his arm. "Mr. Reeves," Sarah said, addressing the board chair, "before you proceed, I need to present documentation that materially affects the validity of everything on this table today." She set a hand on the conference table, her parents' table, in the company her father had built, and did not look at Malcolm at all. The debt instruments being sold today were acquired through fraudulent transfer. The share restructuring that removed my majority position was executed using forged signatures. The power of attorney that authorized those signatures was obtained under false pretenses in what prosecutors will establish was a premeditated scheme to dispossess a beneficial owner. She finally looked at Malcolm. Every transaction he executed from the moment I went into that coma void. The room was absolutely silent. Hannah laid the documents on the table. The SEC investigators stepped forward. Malcolm said, "This is," and then stopped, because there was nothing to say that wasn't already answered by the paper in front of every board member in that room. Board Chair Reeves looked at the documents. He looked at Sarah. He looked at Malcolm. Then he looked at his own attorney, who gave him the most infinitesimal of nods. "I think," Reeves said carefully, "we should suspend this proceeding pending legal review." "That would be the correct decision," the senior SEC investigator said pleasantly. The Queen's new throne. Malcolm was escorted from the building by federal agents at 3:17 p.m. He did not make a scene. He was, Sarah would reflect later, too practiced at appearances to make a scene when it counted least. She watched him go from the conference room window, 42 floors above the city that had been her witness and her battleground, and felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding since the morning she'd signed that power of attorney. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter. The particular piece of a thing finally being true. The board meeting that followed lasted 2 hours. By the end of it, the asset sale was formally suspended, Malcolm's transfers were flagged for full forensic audit, and Sarah had been reinstated as acting CEO pending the legal resolution of what the board chair was already calling, quietly, a case of extraordinary corporate fraud. Hannah Wu shook her hand outside the elevator and said, simply, "Your father would have approved of you today." Sarah couldn't speak for a moment. She just nodded. Jae-Hyun was waiting in the lobby. He had not come up. He had not needed to, this had always been her fight to finish. He stood with his hands in his pockets and that expression of controlled stillness he wore like a second suit, and when she stepped out of the elevator and he saw her face, something in his own face shifted. "Well," he said. "It's done," she said. He nodded, once, like a man receiving news he had already decided to accept. Then, quietly, "Are you all right?" She thought about it honestly, which was something she had not done for a man in a very long time. "I'm not yet," she said. "But I'm going to be." He held the door open for her. They walked out into the Chicago afternoon together, not into a sunset, not into a neat resolution, but into the beginning of something that had no name yet and didn't need one. Edward Global's full restoration would take 14 months of litigation, forensic accounting, and legal negotiation that would eventually result in Malcolm receiving 22 years in federal prison for wire fraud, asset theft, and conspiracy. The lineage clause would be upheld by 2 separate courts. Every dollar he had moved would be recovered. Sarah Edward would ring the New York Stock Exchange opening bell the following spring, standing without a cane, in her mother's pearl earrings. Beside her, not in front of her, not behind her, but beside her, stood a man in a black tailored suit, with the kind of controlled, predatory grace that the cameras couldn't quite capture, and a look on his face that, if you knew how to read it, was the closest thing to open that Jae-Hyun Park had allowed himself in a very long time. The diamond had endured. The diamond had, in fact, prevailed. And that, right there, is where the diamond finally reclaimed her throne. Sarah Edward didn't just survive what Malcolm put her through. She walked back into that boardroom, looked him in the eye, and dismantled every lie he had ever built, one document at a time. And Jae-Hyun Park? A man who operates in shadows, who had every reason to stay invisible, chose her. Chose to risk everything. Because some debts aren't just about money. Some debts are about honor. And honor, as it turns out, is the one thing Malcolm never understood and could never steal. If this story moved you, if you felt every single moment of Sarah's fall and her rise, then do me a favor right now. Hit that like button. It takes you 2 seconds and it means the world to this channel. Every like tells us that you're here, that this story reached you, and that we should keep going. And if you are not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a chapter. We drop new stories regularly, and trust me, you do not want to be the last one to find out what happens next. Now speaking of what happens next, we are just getting started. The alliance between Sarah and Jae-Hyun is only beginning, and the world they are about to build together? It is going to be untouchable. The next video is coming, and it is going to hit even harder than this one. So stay close. Stay subscribed. And until next time. A diamond doesn't ask the earth's permission to be valuable. It simply endures. See you in the next one.